Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for December 11th, 2023. I think we have to talk about what's necessary to change the direction of policy in the world today. It should be clear to everyone that with the proliferation of wars, especially the big wars in Ukraine and Gaza, but civil wars, disruptions all over the world, with poverty, with breakdown of economic situation, collapse of governments, the complete polarization throughout the Western world, what we're doing isn't working. The leaders of the Western world are hopelessly bankrupt when it comes to new ideas, and they keep coming back to retreads. For example, cutting government or spending more money. Instead of thinking about what is it that enabled civilization to advance from small, feudal, squabbling entities to a global circumstance in which you have over 8 billion people, you have institutions of government, you have potentially sovereign states, but instead we have government leaders who are pushing for a world government centered around the idea of a global central banks and private corporate cartels dictating policies. And these private cartels are dictating policies that include both more government and less government. They're not going to give up their power. The problem is the unipolar order. The problem is the power concentrated in the hands of global corporate cartels. Now look at what's happened in the last days. You have Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin on December 6th telling the Congress that if the $61 billion allocation of new appropriations for Ukraine is not passed, it is, quote, very likely, unquote, that there'll be U.S. troops on the ground in Europe fighting Russia. And there was a leaked report that said he later said in private discussions that the sons and daughters of American citizens will be fighting on the ground in Europe against Russia. Well, what happened on December 6th? The Senate blocked more funds. They blocked the $110 billion supplemental allocation for Ukraine and Israel. Now, before that vote, Biden said history will, quote, judge harshly those who turned their backs on freedom's cause. And he attacked Republicans who oppose this. He said they are willing to, quote, kneecap Ukraine on the battlefield and damage our national security, unquote. Now then get ready for the big finish from Joe. He said, if Putin takes Ukraine, he won't stop there. He's going to keep going. He's made that perfectly clear, unquote. This backs up what Lloyd Austin had said back on October 30th, when he said, quote, there's no question in my mind that sooner or later, Putin will challenge NATO, and we'll find ourselves in a shooting match. And he said that after Ukraine falls, a Baltic state will be next. Now, this is hysterical. There's absolutely no evidence that Putin ever intended to take all of Ukraine. If he wanted to, he could have flattened Ukraine the way the United States did Fallujah. This is the modern version of the 1960s, 1970s domino theory, which said that if we don't stay the course in Vietnam, we'll have communists taking over all of Asia and then all of the world. Now, what's been the result of this kind of thinking? Well, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we had the emergence of this idea of the unipolar order, that the U.S. has to be the strongest power in the world and has to be able to exert its influence, meaning military power and economic power, to have only one model that's acceptable of economics, and that's the free market globalist model that came out of the 1980s, in particular the Bush networks and the Clinton networks. In other words, what many people are worried about today, the so-called World Economic Forum, global central bank dictatorship, that's been in place and in operation since the 1990s. It's not fully consolidated because much of the world is rebelling against it, including in Europe and the United States. But look what this meant since 1990 in terms of defense budgets, the amount of money that was put into the military. Remember, we were told after the fall of the Soviet Union that there would be a benefit for spending as a result of the need to reduce defense spending. So in 1990, the defense budget was $325 billion. In 2001, it was $300 billion. So it had dropped in a decade by $25 billion. But then after 9/11, it started going up again. $396 billion in 2003, $402 billion in 2005. By 2016, the last year of Obama's defense budget, it was $534 billion. By 2020, under Trump, it had jumped to $733 billion. And by 2023, it reached $860 billion. That's the spending specifically on military defense. But if you look on the defense budget or the Defense Department's budgetary review, what it reports is that there was an allocation of $1.52 trillion for the 6 sub-departments of the Department of Defense. That's 12.8% of the total U.S. budget. Now, the demand for more money for defense comes from the hysterical failure to recognize that all of that defense funding in support of a unipolar order has been a failure. We lost the Vietnam War. Essentially, after 20 years in Afghanistan, we lost that war. The Iraq War was a completely fake intent. It was supposedly to stop Iraq's support of global terrorism. Instead, it increased global terrorism by the destruction of Iraq. Same with Libya. Same thing as in Syria. Who ended up spending money to defend the so-called moderate rebels who were Islamic terrorists? It was the US. It was NATO. Time and time again, a lie about security led to a greater increase in insecurity. And the same thing's happening now with Ukraine and Gaza. You know, the way it's being presented by Biden is that we have to link Gaza and Ukraine because both are fights against irrational tyrants. Well, had Biden taken the time to study what Putin was proposing over the period since 2006, 2007, he was talking about a security guarantee for everyone. And this was rejected by the United States as an attempt by Russia to subvert global democracy. Now, in terms of the situation in Gaza, how is killing children in Gaza going to provide security in the future for Israel? And sober people in Israel are saying it's not, but they're still saying we have to support this war. Now, here's the point. By linking them together, Biden thinks he can steamroll the Congress in devoting another $110 billion in spending. But polls are showing declining support for Ukraine funding. Now only 19% of those Americans under 30 support the U.S. policy in Gaza, which is to let Israel continue to run amok until Hamas is eviscerated, and supposedly under those circumstances there's a basis for peace. Well, look at the international reaction to the U.S. veto at the UN Security Council. There are demonstrations all over the world, and it's unifying on much more strong terms the global South. At the same time, it's tearing apart the global North. We see collapse of governments in Europe, collapse of support for governments. We see in the United States Biden's negative polling at the highest level ever, and the U.S. is being isolated. Now, in order to try and restore the confidence in the Ukraine war, there was an attempt to get Zelensky to address the Senate last week, which he didn't do for some reason. But it was announced today that tomorrow Biden will be bringing in Zelensky to rally the forces in the Congress to provide the $60+ billion additional funding that Ukraine is asking for, and that actually Ukraine's asking for much more, but that's what Biden's willing to offer. But whatever happened to diplomacy? It's been a victim of this idea of the U.S. as the world's hegemonic power. the unipolar order, the rules-based order, whatever you want to call it, the indispensable nation, according to Madeleine Albright, the policeman of the world, to use the term from the 1960s and 70s. It's not working. In fact, it's moving the world toward more instability, closer to the danger of a nuclear war by accident, and disease and destruction of nations. It's time for a rethink of the political and philosophical underpinnings of our policy. Now, this is something which Helga Zepp-LaRouche took seriously in her drafting of the fundamental principles for a new international strategic and development architecture. I'm going to append this again to the description page, because we're not talking about the World Economic Forum globalist order. We're talking about a world in which sovereign states work together in cooperation, and the emphasis of that cooperation is economic development. That's where security comes from. Security doesn't come from trillions of dollars into the military. If it did, we'd feel much more secure, but it doesn't. Security comes from people having a clear understanding of what is the nature of man and how man has to be unleashed for tackling the real problems facing us, which include hunger and disease, which include stopping wars, which include nations operating on the principle of a recognition of the benefit of the other. And that's what we're initiating as a discussion. So I urge you, join us now before we get to a situation where everything spins out of control. We're almost there.